The air was thick with humidity, making each breath feel heavy. Daniel hurried along the empty sidewalk, streetlights casting long, distorted shadows. He felt a prickle on the back of his neck, a feeling of being watched. He glanced over his shoulder. Nothing. Just his imagination, he told himself. The night was silent except for the rhythmic click of his shoes on the pavement. He quickened his pace, his heart thudding against his ribs. The feeling persisted, a presence lurking just beyond his sight. He resisted the urge to run. That would be giving in to fear. He forced himself to maintain a brisk but steady walk, his eyes darting from side to side, searching for the source of his unease, but the street remained deserted, the houses dark and lifeless. He was almost home now, just a few more yards. He fumbled for his keys, his fingers trembling slightly. He could practically taste the safety of his apartment, the comfort of locked doors and drawn curtains. He just had to make it those last few steps. He froze. There, under the flickering orange glow of the streetlight on the corner, stood a figure. Tall and slender, it seemed to melt out of the shadows, its form indistinct in the dim light. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He stared, his mind struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. The figure remained motionless, shrouded in darkness. He couldn't make out any features, no details of clothing or form. It was just a silhouette, a void in the shape of a person. Daniel's pulse quickened. He wanted to look away, to convince himself it was just a trick of the light, but a strange compulsion held him captive. He couldn't tear his gaze from the figure, from the emptiness where its face should be. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the figure was gone, swallowed by the shadows, leaving Daniel gasping for breath, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He stood there for a moment, paralyzed by a fear he couldn't comprehend. Night after night the figure returned, always under the same streetlight, always shrouded in shadow. Daniel's once peaceful walks home became a torturous ordeal, his every sense on high alert. He was a prisoner of his own fear. Each night the figure seemed to be standing closer. What was once a distant silhouette now loomed larger, its lack of features somehow more terrifying up close. It was as if the darkness itself was taking shape, pressing in on him, suffocating him. He tried to rationalize it. A trick of the light, he told himself, a figment of his imagination, but deep down a primal fear whispered a different truth. This was something sinister, something beyond explanation. The thought of the figure waiting for him, watching him, sent chills down his spine. He found himself changing his route, taking longer detours, hoping to avoid the streetlight and the chilling presence that resided beneath it. One night, driven by a desperate need to confront his fear, Daniel stopped a few houses down from the streetlight. He stood there, his heart hammering in his chest, and stared at the figure. It stood motionless, its emptiness seeming to draw him in. For the first time he noticed something different. The figure seemed to be facing him, its blankness focused on him like an accusation. It was as if it knew he was watching, as if it welcomed his fear. He couldn't stand it any longer. Spinning on his heel, he ran the rest of the way home, his lungs burning, his legs heavy with terror. He fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He slammed the door shut behind him, the sound echoing in the sudden silence of his apartment. He was safe. He was inside. But as he leaned against the door, gasping for breath, he couldn't shake the feeling that the walls of his home were paper thin, that the darkness outside was pressing in, eager to claim him. Sleep offered no escape. Nightmares plagued him, visions of the faceless figure standing at the foot of his bed, its emptiness a gaping maw threatening to swallow him whole. He would wake in a cold sweat, his heart racing, the feeling of dread clinging to him like a shroud. He tried everything to keep the fear at bay. He kept the lights on at night, the brightness a meager comfort against the encroaching darkness. He checked the locks on his doors and windows obsessively, as if physical barriers could hold back the intangible. But the fear was insidious, seeping into every aspect of his life. He couldn't concentrate at work, his mind constantly replaying the image of the figure. He withdrew from friends and family, isolating himself in his growing paranoia. He was a prisoner in his own home, too terrified to venture out, yet unable to find solace within its walls. The outside world had become a source of terror, and his apartment, once a sanctuary, was now a cage. The storm raged outside, mirroring the turmoil in Daniel's mind. Rain lashed against the windows, the wind howling like a banshee. He sat huddled on his bed, every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind sending a jolt of fear through him. Suddenly the power went out, plunging his apartment into darkness. The storm's fury seemed to press against the windows, shaking the very foundation of his building. He fumbled for his phone, his hand shaking so badly he could barely dial. He was about to call for help, to seek solace in another human voice, when he heard it. A soft, shuffling sound coming from his living room, slow and deliberate, footsteps. Fear, cold and paralyzing, gripped him. He knew with a certainty that defied logic that he was no longer alone. The faceless figure had breached the supposed safety of his home. It was here in the darkness with him. He rose from the bed, his body moving on instinct, and crept towards his bedroom door. His hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob, his breath catching in his throat. He could hear the footsteps now, closer, right outside his door. He threw open the door. A flash of lightning illuminated the hallway, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. And there it stood, the faceless figure, closer than ever before, its emptiness seeming to devour the meager light. He stumbled back, his heart pounding against his ribs like a drum, but there was nowhere left to run. He was trapped, cornered in his own home by the embodiment of his deepest fears. The figure took a step towards him, then another. It moved with an eerie grace, its silence more terrifying than any scream. He watched in horror as it glided towards him, its lack of features somehow more menacing in the darkness. Another flash of lightning. He caught a glimpse of himself reflected in the hallway mirror, his face contorted in terror. But something was wrong. His reflection, it had no face. He stared in disbelief, his mind reeling. The reflection mimicked his movements, its emptiness staring back at him, accusing, mocking. He was looking into his own personal abyss. The faceless figure reached out, its form wavering in the darkness. He couldn't tear his gaze away from the reflection, from the chilling truth it revealed. The emptiness wasn't just in the figure, it was in him. He felt a strange sense of calm wash over him, a resignation to the inevitable. He had been running from himself, from the darkness that resided within him. Now he realized there was nowhere left to run. The figure enveloped him, its coldness seeping into him, chilling him to the bone. He closed his eyes, accepting the embrace of the faceless, the embrace of his own fear. He didn't scream, he didn't struggle. He simply surrendered to the darkness, feeling it wrap around him like a shroud, smothering him, consuming him. The storm subsided. Dawn broke, casting a pale light through the window. The apartment was silent, the air thick with a lingering sense of dread. In the hallway, the mirror reflected the rising sun, its surface now clear, the reflection gone. The faceless figure was no more, but the terror remained, for Daniel was no more. In his place stood the figure, its form now solid, its emptiness a chilling reflection of the man it had consumed. It stepped out of the apartment and into the awakening city, another face lost in the crowd, another soul swallowed by the darkness. And as the days turned into nights and the nights into endless cycles of fear, it searched for others who, like Daniel, had looked into the abyss and found their own reflections staring back. The faceless stalker, forever seeking to fill the void within, forever perpetuating the cycle of terror. The nightmare, it seemed, had only just begun.